there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, across markets today, stocks climbed in relief after the U.S. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell sounded less hawkish than expected in his testimony to Congress. Now, emerging market stocks surged 1.5% on the day to scale 7-week highs. Gains across the bourses put the MSCI Equity Index on track for its best session in over a month. In South Africa, resources and industrials led the gainers. Resources were up almost 4%. In Nigeria, the NSE All Share inching up almost 2% on the day. Analysts say sentiment is upbeat on a good corporate performance in the first quarter, as well as the implementation of parts of the Petroleum Act. Now, also coming up on the show today, the World Bank cautions over economic growth and rising levels of inequality. The UK Prime Minister under pressure to resign for hosting a party during COVID restrictions. And inflation in China drops on the back of easing food and energy costs. Well, we start off today's show with the global economic outlook. The World Bank has slashed its global growth forecast for 2022 and 2023. That is, as it cautioned that a rise in inflation, debt and income inequality could jeopardize the recovery in emerging and developing economies. Now, in its latest semi-annual forecast, the World Bank predicted that world economic growth will decelerate markedly to 4.1% this year. That's from 5.5% last year. And it'll also drop to 3.2% in 2023. Now, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, the Washington-based lender has raised the alarm about growing levels of inequality, both within and between nations. It is now forecasting a yawning gap in growth rates between advanced and less wealthy economies. Richer nations are expected to see a deceleration in economic growth from 5% last year to 3.8% in 2022 and 2.3% in 2023. Now, for emerging and developing economies, by contrast, the bank is calling for growth rates to plunge from 6.3% in 2021 to 4.6% this year and 4.4% in 2023. Well, let's discuss that World Bank report further with Anthony Mveyange. He is the Executive Director at the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research. Great to have you on the show with us today, sir. Now, this World Bank, it's certainly warning that developing nations will fall further behind the rich world. In fact, David Malpass said that there was a canyon between growth rates in rich and poor countries. Now, the outlook for weaker countries is still to fall further and further behind. Do you agree with this assessment? And what are the greatest risks that increase the likelihood of a hard landing for developing nations?
Well, thank you. I partially, to some extent, I agree with that assessment, but by and large, I think I speak in terms of African continent, the context is slightly different. And if there's any predictions about how Africa would respond to COVID and the global growth projections, if there's one thing that we have learned over the last 2 years is that most of these projections turned out not to be the case. So in terms of what we expect to see in Africa, unlike developed countries, most of African countries have not locked down their economies. If you look at the current projections from, for example, the IMF and AFDB, Sub-Saharan Africa is projected to grow, albeit modestly, but it does give an indication that Africa is not necessarily on the wrong trajectory. However, in terms of the risks that countries can face, if global economy is actually in turmoil, one of the areas that likely African countries are likely to be affected is on the loans, for example, if because of inflation that is actually picking up in the world, a high interest rate that can actually have a ramification on debt restructuring for African countries, and it can impose more burden for the governments to settle the debts with the Western countries.
Right. And of course, as you're talking about risks there, David Malpass blamed stimulus programs in richer nations for worsening that divide, like you mentioned, by driving global inflation. Now, he also warned that higher borrowing costs could hurt economic activity going forward. What are your thoughts or your views on how Africa can mitigate the harm?
Well, yes. High interest rate can actually, because of high inflation, central banks in the West, they'll need to impose high interest rate, contractionary monetary policy to actually control for this high inflation. And that can actually have a very high direct ramification on African countries, particularly those that they went out on borrowing spree in the last 2 years after COVID onset came on board. Now, what can countries do? So it depends what these loans are borrowed for. If they're recurrent expenditure, I think it's not a good trajectory for African countries. But if those loans are used for development expenditure, maybe something positive could actually be achieved. However, one of the ways to mitigate that is African countries to rethink their borrowing approach. Do they really need to borrow from the West? Do they really, given the turmoil in the global economy right now, given the pessimistic growth projections that we see? So I think it's important in terms of mitigating the situation. Perhaps African countries can borrow less, or maybe they can actually think about borrowing internally as opposed to borrowing externally.
Well, looking forward, some actually believe that it will be central banks and not the pandemic that will drive global economies in 2022. What role then do you think that African central banks can play in helping to cushion African economies going forward?
Yes, I think central banks are going to play a very important role. And I think one of the major roles that central banks will do is the monetary policy. Especially if there's high inflation, the central banks across the continent will be forced to impose the contractionary monetary policy to contain the inflation, and that will trigger increases in interest rates in the continent, lower prices on bonds so that they can withdraw money from the system. You know, that's one way, and a major way that the central banks can actually have a very direct control. But beyond the central banks, also governments, for example, through revenue authorities, through fiscal policies, they can try to impose wages and price controls, which also, of course, if not done right, can actually have potential ramifications on recession and unemployment in the continent, which is already a very time-ticking bomb that we are facing. So I think that central bank can play a very good role, controlling role, effective role in ensuring that the loans, the money supply is contained in a way that inflation is not becoming a challenging issue in the continent. Because with high inflations, we understand the potential welfare impacts that could come about because of that.
Right. Well, we do have to leave it there. Many thanks for those great insights. That, of course, was Anthony Mveyange. He is the Executive Director at the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research. Well, let's move on now. The African Development Bank has announced a $14 million grant to boost food security, value addition, and also trade in South Sudan. According to the financial institution's country manager for South Sudan, the 5-year project will be implemented by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. That's in conjunction with South Sudan's Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security. Now, the AFDB says the project will create aggregation business opportunities for farmers and traders, including women and youth. It further stressed that the grant would provide them with new skills and knowledge and the agro-processing equipment they need to produce competitive products. Nearly 1 million people across South Sudan have been affected by heavy floods. That's according to the United Nations. Now, the debate over national debt continues in Tanzania, with President Samia Suluhu Hassan saying loans taken were sustainable and that there was room for more borrowing going forward. But according to the central banks, Tanzania's national debt stock swelled by $5.3 billion in the year leading up to October 2021. While CGTN's Daniel Kijo has been following the story from Dar es Salaam.
The debate over whether to keep borrowing is perhaps the most burning question currently in Tanzanian politics. The country's $35.7 billion foreign debt is causing an alarm. President Samia Suluhu Hassan's government says it is not discouraged from seeking external funding. President Hassan said the loans are to fund strategic projects, including the construction of the standard gauge railway.
We have been borrowing since way back, and even the development we have now is due to these loans. So I don't see why these loans are being considered a big deal. It's not a big deal. Our focus is to continue developing our people.
According to the central bank, the country can borrow up to 70% of its GDP, and it had only reached 27.9% in 2020. Analysts say, with Tanzania being one of the most conservative borrowers in East Africa, there's nothing to be alarmed about.
So we are nowhere in terms of the radar of being an alarmingly highly indebted country. We are able to service the debt certainly by the amounts that we're able to generate from tax revenues and other areas. But there is you must continue to be cautious, and I think I trust that the government will be able to do that and to borrow more smartly going forward as well.
Tanzania is currently ranked 109 out of 170 highly indebted countries globally. The debate over Tanzania's borrowing was sparked by the Speaker of the National Assembly, Job Ndugai, who criticized the borrowing trend under President Samia Suluhu Hassan, saying that the country is better off relying on internal revenue sources to finance development projects. He has since resigned from his post. Experts say the government keeps focusing on concessional financing in order to ensure that projects they fund have a large impact on growth and exports.
It helps you to be transparent. It helps you to effectively utilize the borrowing to create capacity, to create capital formation in countries so that you can be much more productive, create competitive exports that gives you the surplus, that creates the revenues, that removes you off the loan wheel cycle and helps you reduce the amount that you're borrowing at.
In the first 9 months of President Samia Suluhu Hassan's leadership, Tanzania received about $3 billion in loans. Many say this is due to President Hassan's improved relations with development partners. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania.
And now let's take a look at our corporate headlines today. Zambia's leading mobile services provider, MTN, has announced the launch of its 5G network pilot platform in the country. MTN Zambia will be rolling out 5G pilot demonstration sites in Lusaka and Copperbelt provinces in partnership with Chinese tech giant Huawei. Now, it plans to set up specific and relevant use cases together with Zambian customers and partners to expand social and commercial horizons. Meanwhile, Nigeria has committed to pay the full capital arrears of $28.7 million in Shelter Afrique. The payment will be made in 4 installments starting January 2022. In September 2020, the Pan-African Housing Development Financier received $9.4 million from Nigeria. The contribution moved Nigeria to becoming the second largest shareholder in the organization, behind Kenya and ahead of the AfDB. And Kenya's 2021 mobile money use hit a historic high. Data from the Central Bank of Kenya shows that users moved about $55.1 billion on phones between January and November in 2021. That surpassed the $45.9 billion transacted in the entire 2020. Now, during the 11 months, the highest ever mobile money transaction in a month was recorded in November at around $5.5 billion. The surge in transactions came despite the government removing COVID-19 subsidies at the start of 2021. And finally, South Africa's large alcohol producers are struggling to satisfy demand. South African Breweries says that it's struggling to fill all its orders after being hit hard by supply chain constraints. Now, Distell, which produces Savannah, Hunters and Klipdrift, has also confirmed it's experiencing severe glass shortages and a shortage of aluminum used in the production of cans and corks. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. Well, let's head into a short break now, still coming up on the show. The UK Prime Minister under pressure to resign for hosting a party during COVID restrictions. And Egypt's economy looks up amid tough COVID influence pressure on businesses.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
A little tense here. Bottles are being thrown. As they do so,
there are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
is the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from
within
the front
clear
line.
view of this front line position.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back. Well, let's head to Egypt now, where price pressures eased across all non-oil businesses and business activities were more stable in the country in December 2021. That is according to a latest business survey. The seasonally adjusted Purchasing Managers Index rose to its highest level in 4 months in December to 49.0. That's up from 48.7 in November. Well, from Cairo, here's Yasser Hakim with the latest on that economic data.
The improved non-oil private sector activity in the last quarter of 2021 is mainly owed to a stronger performance by exports, which rose to a record high $31 billion in 2021, as well as the rebound in tourism sector, which is a main source of hard currency revenue for the North African state that was badly damaged by COVID-related travel restrictions. However, at 49 points, which was up from 48.7 in November, the Purchasing Managers Index still remains in contraction for the 13th month in a row.
The coronavirus pandemic is the reason for the slow growth. The pandemic had fully stagnated the Egyptian and the global economy, especially during the peak of the crisis. This had negative effects such as a drop in production, which led to a drain in available reserves and stocks, compounded by the closure of airports and transports links across the globe. Other negative effects were on unemployment rates, which slightly increased during that period. But the early gradual reopening of the economy and increasing production and economic activity has improved conditions.
The government, along with the central bank, had taken several measures in the last 2 years to stimulate the market and support the non-oil private sector.
The government launched initiatives focusing on small and medium enterprises and feeder industries aimed at replacing important products with locally produced goods. It has encouraged local manufacturing to reduce dependence on foreign products, to increase production in factories and reduce imports, thereby save on hard currency expenditure. This policy is slowly increasing the PMI rate.
Experts say the ongoing mega infrastructure projects and rebuilding process by the North African country are also attracting considerable foreign investments into the market, giving a boost to the private sector. The outlook for 2022 seems more optimistic, as analysts expect the private sector activity to cross the 50-point mark, thus bringing an expansion to the economy by mid-2022. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Well, let's head to the UK now, where British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has apologized for attending an event in the back garden of number 10 Downing Street on May the 20th, 2020, when the country was under strict COVID rules. At the start of the weekly session of Prime Minister's Questions, Johnson did admit to attending the gathering for 25 minutes before going inside to work. He also said he believed the gathering to be a work event. Now, leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, said the UK Prime Minister's excuse that he did not realize he was at a party. He says that was ridiculous and offensive. It said around 40 Downing Street staff members attended the Bring Your Own Bottle gathering.
Number 10 is a big department with the garden as an extension of the office, which has been in constant use because of the role of fresh air in stopping the virus. And when I went into that garden just after 6 on the 20th of May 2020 to thank groups of staff before going back into my office 25 minutes later to continue working, I believed implicitly that this was a work event. But, Mr. Speaker, with hindsight, I should have sent everyone back inside. I should have found some other way to thank them. And I should have recognized that even if it could be said technically to fall within the guidance, there would be millions and millions of people who simply would not see it that way, people who suffered terribly, people who were forbidden from meeting loved ones at all, inside or outside. And to them and to this House, I offer my heartfelt apologies.
Well, let's delve into the implications of all this with Andrew Wilson. He joins us now in London. Great to have you with us, Andrew. Now, according to reports, a majority of British citizens actually believe that if Johnson did attend, like he just admitted, then he should resign as a Prime Minister. So what next for the Prime Minister? Can he be forced out by a vote in Parliament? Are there also any signs that maybe he could resign?
There's no sign that he'll resign at all. He's made no moves towards that. He's quite clear he intends to stay in his job, so that's off the table. In terms of Parliament voting him out, they also have no powers to do that. The way to get a Prime Minister out of power is to have a general election where the country is called together to decide. And there's no general election scheduled in the UK for at least another 2 years, and it's within the Prime Minister's power to call that. So there's no sign of that taking place either. He can be removed by his own party with an internal leadership change process, but at this stage there's no sign of that happening now. The apology he offered in Parliament today is in the face of pressure from the opposition, as we saw just now in Parliament, pressure from public opinion, but also pressure from his own party saying they're unhappy with his performance thus far. His apology was designed to bring his own people back on board so that they do not start a leadership change process. At the moment, the signs are that a lot of his people, his MPs in his party, are making up their minds, but have not decided yet to push that any further. So for the time being, Boris Johnson is waiting to see if this will all go away.
Well, what really then are the implications of his latest admission? Because we know he has had a string of scandals, which has led some to question how fit he is for office going forward. What are the chances that he can ride this out without coming out unscathed?
Well, that's what he's trying to do. I mean, there is an official government inquiry being run by a senior civil servant called Sue Gray. She's investigating at least 9 reports of different gatherings in government buildings, most of them Downing Street, but other government buildings as well, to have taken place between May 2020 and Christmas 2021. The important one, and the one that's being argued about in Parliament today, is this party in May 2020, which at the time it took place, 30 to 40 individuals gathered in the garden of Downing Street, where the Prime Minister himself has now admitted he was in attendance for a short period of time. That was at a time when it was illegal for people to meet outside their household more than one person. And that meeting of one person only had to be taking place in the open air. So this was strict lockdown conditions. Schools were closed. All the non-essential shops and trading centres, restaurants, cafes, hotels, these were all closed as well. This was a time when the general public, under pain of being fined by the police, was being told to stay at home. Now, the fact that this group took place in the garden of Downing Street, the current narrative from the Prime Minister is that this was to do with work, that the Downing Street is a work event, not a residential event. But the Prime Minister, of course, does happen to live there, and he's hoping that this argument will carry him through. Now, he's apologised, but in his apology, he was careful not to take responsibility and not to admit that he or anyone in his employ at the time was breaking lockdown rules.
Well, let's talk a bit more about that ongoing inquiry into parties taking place in Downing Street. Apparently, any minister found breaching the code is expected to resign. So where do current members of Johnson's cabinet stand, given that we have seen a number of stories about numerous parties taking place?
Well, there have been breakings of the ministerial code discussed before, particularly under Prime Minister Johnson's premiership. So, for example, Priti Patel was questioned about her conduct at work, but was not deemed to have broken a ministerial code, and that went away. What it illustrated, that case, was that it's up to the Prime Minister to decide himself whether anyone breaks the ministerial code. So this can take place, but it's within the Prime Minister to hire or fire his cabinet members. Now, last year, cabinet member, former Health Secretary Matt Hancock was photographed in an embrace with a colleague, and that was deemed to have broken lockdown rules, and he resigned. But there was pressure for him to do so. Allegra Stratton, about 4 weeks ago, the Prime Minister's press representative, resigned as well, having been filmed laughing and making light of these incidents of parties. And Simon Case, Cabinet Secretary in Downing Street, has also resigned over these parties. So there's definitely a sign that the knives are out for people to be held responsible. Whether that spreads to cabinet ministers and whether that spreads to the Prime Minister himself is another question. This civil servant, looking into all these allegations of parties, can pass judgment and can make a conclusion over whether lockdown rules were broken or not, but that has to be referred back to the Prime Minister. It's up to him to decide whether anyone should lose their job. He's unlikely to suggest that he loses his own job, because this is not a man who likes to resign.
Quite right. Well, we'll certainly be watching that closely. Many thanks for that update, Andrew. That is Andrew Wilson joining us there in London. Well, let's head to Libya now. The country is set to restart oil exports from two key western ports. That's after militias ended a blockade of pipelines. Now, the state-controlled National Oil Corporation lifted a force majeure at the ports of Zawiya and Melita on Tuesday. The terminals and the fields serving them, including Sharara, which is Libya's biggest, shut down for about 3 weeks after a paramilitary force known as the Petroleum Facilities Guard closed pipelines in a dispute over pay. Now, the country's shipments and production in the east also continue to be hit by bad weather. Libya's overall production briefly rebounded to 1 million barrels a day this week when Sharara restarted, but remains below 900,000 barrels a day. The weather disruptions in the east have also led to the closure of at least 4 ports this week. And adding to Uganda now, where authorities have agreed to allow cargo truck crews with negative COVID-19 test results to transit through the country. As Leon Senyange now reports, hundreds of trucks have been stuck at the Uganda-Kenya border as truck drivers protested the new COVID-19 containment measures.
These are some of the first trucks to arrive into Uganda since the decision was made. A resolution by ministers from 4 East African countries agreed that Uganda would allow truck drivers with negative COVID-19 results from member countries to transit through to their destinations. The settlement followed a 6-day strike by the drivers who protested Uganda's proposed review of the cargo and drivers tracking system. The system allowed COVID-19 testing done within a duration of 7 instead of 14 days. The protest paralyzed business at the Malaba border post, which is one of the major entry points for trucks bringing in goods from Kenya's port of Mombasa. Uganda is a transit route for imports destined for Rwanda, South Sudan, and even the Democratic Republic of Congo. At the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, Uganda was offering free coronavirus tests to truck drivers. However, a $30 fee was later introduced to cover government costs. Now, all countries have agreed that free antigen tests will be done. All fully vaccinated drivers should have their negative results valid for 14 days. The situation will be reviewed next week. Leon Sanyange, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
And let's head to Tunisia now, where authorities are planning to institute several measures as the government tries to reach a deal with the International Monetary Fund before the end of the first quarter of 2022. Now, the measures include cutting subsidies on energy products, freezing civil service wages, and hiring over the next 3 years. But as Adnan Shaushi now reports, activists have warned that the proposed reforms could exacerbate the country's economic and social crisis.
The Tunisian non-governmental organization iWatch published a copy of the program developed by the North African state's government ahead of crucial talks with the International Monetary Fund for a much-needed financial bailout. The NGO denounced lack of government communication on its plans with the multilateral lender.
This secret document was developed by the government without discussing its content with experts from the Labor Union and the Confederation of Industry. This plan will have negative repercussions on the Tunisian economy. Authorities know that voters will reject these reforms. These might impact the legislative elections in December 2022. That is why the painful measures will be imposed in 2023 after the elections.
iWatch revealed that the gradual lifting of subsidies on energy products will pave the way for reaching real prices by 2026. It will also increase low-voltage electricity prices for Tunisian households. Accordingly, the government will also develop a digital platform for registration and management of the targeted subsidization of commodities.
There are too many contradictions in the approach of the government. What it says to the Tunisian people is different from what it plans with the IMF in terms of structural reforms. This is unacceptable.
However, Tunisia's finance minister explained that the government is preparing a consensual program for major reforms that will stabilize and kickstart economic recovery after the pandemic fallout and years of political instability.
The government has developed a draft reform document for Tunisia. It could coincide or intersect with the reform plan made by the International Monetary Fund. We will discuss these structural reforms and agree on this document with all our partners at home before presenting it to the IMF.
The 2022 state budget provides for early retirement before the legal age of 62. The government also encourages civil servants to start their own businesses. These measures are aimed at reducing the public sector wage bill in the North African country. Tunisian authorities said that a set of realistic and acceptable reforms may be reached with the IMF before the end of the first quarter of 2022. Civil society organizations are calling for a dialogue on the country's structural reforms before a deal is signed with the US-based lender. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a short break now, but still coming up on the show. Inflation in China drops on the back of easing food and energy costs. And remittances from migrant workers keep Mexico's economy afloat.
Change is on the horizon. Through the shifting of time, Africa's emerging tech landscape is creating new channels.
There's a hunger for local African content globally.
Shaped by innovation, carved out by a new generation of digital entrepreneurs, sculpted by a mobile revolution, and trickling down to the most remote corners of the continent. TechSpot is seeking out the new concepts in technology, disrupting Africa's traditional sectors.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Welcome to the world today on CGTN.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
And here's a quick recap of other top headlines this hour. At least 9 people have been killed and many more injured after an Al-Shabaab suicide bomber detonated a car bomb close to Mogadishu International Airport. Now, the Islamist militant group Al-Shabaab said it carried out the attack. The blast took place on a road by the entrance to a camp for the Somali Air Force, which is close to the international airport. Meanwhile, 8 soldiers, including a high-ranking commander, have been detained over alleged plans to destabilize Burkina Faso's institutions. According to a statement by the Military Prosecutor's Office, the plot was being planned by a group of soldiers. An investigation has been launched and the suspected soldiers are now being questioned. Burkina Faso's government has come under pressure over failures to stem a 6-year insurgency that has forced 1.4 million people to flee their homes. And the UN's special representative to Mali has briefed the Security Council on some of the hurdles that the country is facing. Mali is struggling to cope with several challenges in its transitional process, as well as new ECOWAS sanctions. Now, El Gassam Wane told the UN Security Council that every effort should be made to resolve problems linked to the transition process. Wayne also warned that a protracted impasse would make it harder to find a consensual way out. UN Mali representatives, of course, briefed the Security Council. And that's a recap of other headlines this hour. And more international news. Consumer inflation in China nudged down in December on the back of easing food and energy costs. The consumer price index rose 1.5% year on year, down from 2.3% in November. That's slightly below analyst expectations. Factory gate inflation also came in lower than expected year on year. It was the second straight month of easing PPI after the index rose for 4 consecutive months and piled pressure on officials to stop costs from spiraling out of control. Now, prices of industrial products dropped as well due to decreases in international commodity prices. For the full year of 2021, CPI rose 0.9% and PPI 8.1%, and that's compared with 2020. So why then is inflation in China now slowing down? Here's Zhang Shixuan with more.
Plasterboard, high-performance plastics, automotive glass, pipes, adhesive, and sealant. While most people may not know all these professional terms from the industrial world, they will be very familiar with the products they help manufacture: building decorations, auto parts, and medical equipment. But crucial as these components are, they require a wide range of raw materials, including cement, sand, and gypsum. But headwinds from rising prices of commodities like these have given industrial materials manufacturer Saint-Gobain an average 10% increase in their raw materials prices during 2021.
With very sharp increase, for instance, cement increased by around 20%. Also energy in the year end, in the Q4, increased a lot, 20, 30, sometimes 40% in some cities.
China's thermal coal futures prices skyrocketed to a historic high of almost 2,000 yuan per ton in October, from a low point of 750 in August. But those prices have gradually declined since October, when the National Development and Reform Commission began repeatedly asking investors to avoid speculation and hoarding of energy resource used in heating. The most active thermal coal futures contract dropped to lower than 700 yuan per ton on December 7th, more than 65% lower than its historic high. Prices of other commodity futures, including those of steel, aluminum, glass, paper pulp, and PVC, have also fallen sharply.
Actually, we saw a surge in the inflation around September, October, when there were those electricity shortage problems. This caused some raw material to double suddenly the price. And actually, things went much smoother when the central government of China said that continuity of supply of electricity was very important and that we should not stop electricity supply. And then also we see now the demand with winter is a bit slowing down. So as the demand decreases, things are getting more stable now.
Led by the falling production costs, China's producer price inflation started to ease in November 2021, retreating to a growth rate of 12.9% year-on-year. That was down from October's 26-year high of 13.5%, reflecting the government's efforts to control surging commodity prices and stabilizing energy supply. Some experts predict that commodity prices may continue to decline in the future.
At the end of last year, China's economy gradually recovered, with domestic supplies gradually returning to normal. That helped bring prices back. And also due to the global pandemic situation, the demand worldwide has not recovered significantly, whereas global commodity supplies have gradually recovered. Since last September, global commodity prices started to drop. The influence of the pandemic will gradually be alleviated, so that demand will gradually recover. It's hard to see big fluctuations in the future.
And that Paris-headquartered industrial materials manufacturing giant is now continuing with its big business plans here. Last November, the company completed purchase of a factory in Anhui to expand its production, and is actively working on new solutions to manage fluctuating prices.
We have also a lot of research, innovation, to see how to replace cement by more sustainable materials like slag, waste coming from deconstruction of buildings. And systematically now, when we build a new plant, we make the roof compatible with solar panels so that we can be more autonomous by using renewable energy, which is cheaper than the normal, more traditional source of electricity.
China's PPI for the full year of 2021 grew by 8.1%, indicating that policies to secure supplies and stabilize prices continue to have their effect through December. Zhang Shixuan, ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
Now, after that holiday season, belt tightening is common around the world, and that's the case for many people in Mexico. In this new year, Mexico's economy is still staggering from the effects of the pandemic, but as CGTN's Frank Contreras reports, migrant remittances are helping to keep families out of hard times.
The town of Tonatico, Mexico, is a place where well-paying jobs are scarce, but the economy stays afloat because generations of migrant workers have left the town and moved to the United States. One of the migrants, Luis Hernandez, has returned from California to visit his elderly mother. The pandemic prevented him from seeing her for 2 years. Each month, he sends her $1,000. During this visit, he sees firsthand how his remittances help keep his mother and father fed.
I would be in a very sad situation like other families who receive no help. But my 3 sons send me money so that we don't have to suffer.
All 3 of her sons, including Luis, migrated to the United States. During the 2 months he's here visiting, he has also seen the impact of rising inflation.
All prices have risen since I was here last 2 years ago. I'm realizing that I need to send more money each month to cover rising costs.
Remittances from migrant workers cover those costs. The total amount of money set a record in 2021, when more than $51 billion was sent back to Mexico. The people of Tonatico welcome the help.
Banking experts in Mexico calculate that each year, migrants in the United States send between $7 and $10 million a year to this small town in south-central Mexico.
The walls of the town show how people here feel about the ongoing tensions in the United States over the issue of immigration. The man who created the mural, Luis Sotelo, also receives payments from migrants who purchase his paintings.
During the holidays, people here don't have much income. The migrants bring or send money, and that helps keep people here from going hungry or from lacking things.
This town and many others like it depend on migrant remittances. It's become a way of life, and many young people, seeing no bright future here, say they also plan to migrate to the United States. Frank Contreras, CGTN, Tonatico, Mexico.
Now, over the years, emojis and stickers have become part of a multi-million-dollar global industry. But on What's Hot Tonight, we'll explore how designing the little icons can be a cutthroat business, and not everyone is smiling, as CGTN's Huang Fei now reports.
This was the most used emoji in 2021. That's according to Unicode, the global standard-setting organization for computer text. But if you live in China and use WeChat, chances are you've also used this more expressive version. The mushroom head emoji series has been downloaded over 900 million times. Wu Ze is literally the head of the company behind them.
Many of my newer emojis are based on my own face. When I can't find words for my feelings, I take a selfie and create emojis around it. In the beginning, I used my friend's face because I thought he had a funny look. People like realistic expressions. Life can be hard sometimes, but we can cry it out or laugh it off together.
During the heydays, Wu would receive thousands of dollars a month just from user rewards. That's when people tipped the author through WeChat Pay. Now, most of his income comes from image licensing. But business has suffered due to COVID-19 as companies slashed marketing budgets.
Art is tough business. Emojis have been free of charge until about 2 years ago. Most Chinese people are used to not paying for the artwork. Plus, emojis are like fast fashion. People always want new ones to express how they feel. So they'd rather not pay for something they'll delete soon.
For emoji artists, China's go-to messenger app WeChat is a coveted fan base, with 1.2 billion monthly active users. But it's also an open platform where anyone with a phone can create and upload their own stickers.
Let's say you've just designed a new set of emojis and want to make it big on WeChat. There is a sticker gallery that allows users like me to find new expressions. If a lot of people download your stickers, you'll be in the top picks. Now, the goose is #1 on my list because I use it all the time. But WeChat is also recommending all these other popular emojis to me. The list goes on and on and on. So your new and yet unknown emojis may only have a few weeks to climb up this chart before they're buried by newcomers.
For characters that break through the noise, animator Zheng Zexin says the applications are endless, from clothes and accessories to video games and animated movies.
IP 它是一个全球化的。
Creative intellectual property is a global industry. I believe it was worth $20 billion by 2020. Young people are the main consumers. They'll buy limited edition products with unique designs. Right now, Chinese chic is in style. Designs with traditional cultural elements are a big hit because they make us feel nostalgic.
Wu thinks his mushroom heads could play bigger roles in the future, including starring in his own theme park. For now, though, he's focusing on helping us smile during these challenging times. Huang Fei, CGTN, Guangzhou.
Well, on that note, let's take a look at commodity markets today. A less confident tone from the U.S. Fed chairman moved all oil prices higher today. They hit two-month highs on tight supply and easing concerns about the impact of the Omicron variant on demand. Meanwhile, gold prices also easing today as traders keep an eye out for U.S. inflation data for those rate clues after Powell's tone fueled a gold rally in the previous session. Well, let's take a short break now, but still to come on the show. A Kenyan startup develops an affordable and clean alternative to charcoal fuel for low-income consumers.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
I've been Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg, Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. Now, charcoal isn't just a big source of energy for many households in Africa. It is also a key source of air pollution and deforestation. Well, a Kenyan company developed a potential solution in 2021. M-Gas focuses on the low-income market for low-emission cooking fuels. It supplies gas tanks fitted with tamper-proof smart valves that allow customers to pay for the LPG they use in small increments. Take a look.
When dusk blankets Nairobi, Kenya's capital, many dinners simmer over charcoal fires. But a Kenyan startup, M-Gas, is breaking into the low-income market for clean cooking fuels. They use gas tanks fitted with tamper-proof smart valves that allow customers to pay for gas in small increments.
This innovation is very important because it's reducing deforestation around cities in Africa, also improving the health of people cooking with biomass, like mostly women and children, and then how households can afford these fuels and are accessible to them.
Recently, MGas received $25 million from UK-based Circle Gas, whose investors include regional telecoms giant Safaricom. Aside from driving deforestation, using dirty cooking fuels generates about as much greenhouse gases as the aviation industry, about 2% of the global total, according to the World Bank. For many years, there was little alternative. But the recent explosion of mobile money, more affordable technology to build smart meters, and urbanization have combined to make pay-as-you-go gas competitive.
MGas ninaona ikinipeleka mzuri.
I feel MGas serves me better as there is no smoke and it cooks my tea faster than when I used to cook using the stove and kerosene. It would take a really long time. Now I only pay whatever amount that is available to me for MGas.
MGas installs the stove, 13-kilogram gas cylinder and meters, collectively worth around $80 in customers' homes for free. Buying the same size tanks outright costs around $22 and is too expensive for many families. The smart meters on the MGas tanks mean customers can make small payments, even meal by meal, on their mobile phones. It also alerts the company when the gas is about to run out and a new tank is delivered free of charge. The cost of the stove, meters and delivery is paid through a small premium on the overall price of the gas, so there's no upfront costs. It takes around 2 years for the cost of the equipment to be fully paid off. According to the WHO, the potential market is huge. Around 3 billion people globally use dirty fuel for cooking, contributing to air pollution that causes an estimated 4 million premature deaths each year. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
Well, before we leave you today, a quick look at Africa's currencies. South Africa's rand pretty flat today, pausing after it saw overnight gains on comments by the US Fed chair, which of course allayed market fears of a sudden withdrawal of US monetary support that had weighed on risky assets today. Meanwhile, Nigeria's naira appreciating against the dollar by about 0.06% at the investors and exporters window. That, of course, was fueled by a slight decline in FX turnover at that I&E window, according to data from the FMDQ Securities Exchange. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.